What's going on, guys? Twig and Timber Outdoors, and today I'm going to break down 3 of the most common, at least as far as I'm concerned, ways to catch steelhead or lake run fish up here in the Great Lakes region. So we're going to take you out in the field, take a look at some basic ways we can go ahead and fish for these fish, and some of the more common ways we do it around these regions. So the first one we're going to take a look at is the swing. So for our streamer swinging setup, I typically like to have a sink tip line on a 6 to 8 weight rod, depending on whether or not you're fishing in waters where there are salmon. If there are salmon, typically like a 9 weight rod is best, but for the majority of applications near me, when we swing a 6 to 8 weight rod is great, and a 9 foot or 8/6 length, and because of the width of the waters and the retrieval style. I love this reel. It happens to be a koala fly, razorback, in the 6 to 7, and this is a Snowy sink tip line on an Outlaw 6 weight. It's a wanted edition. Great rods, does a really good job, great flexibility, great action, castability is fantastic, just does a really fine job. But the key here is nice and castable, sensitive tip, but not too long to where you can keep that rod tip low, and also sink tip or sinking or intermediate line, something that gets your fly to depth. Additionally, making sure your loop knots for your streamers are good, and making sure that you are. I also sometimes fish a poly leader on a floating line, depending on the depth needed to get that fly down in front of the fish's face. So now let's take a look at the proper techniques or ways that I like to swing for fish here on the Lake Erie and Ontario trips. So fishing a streamer is basically an attempt to get a streamer or fly when you're swinging, or wet fly if you have you, to stay taut at the end of my line, essentially kind of like this, going through a run perpendicularly to the run. Now, the way we typically try to start to do this is, the good way to start is to go 45 degrees as you're facing downstream, and you make your cast, and you kind of see what happens. If it engages immediately, it stays taut, and you see that the fly stays right at the end of your lowered rod tip, and you see your line straight out, you're probably good to go. But if you notice that the fly swings way faster or way slower than the part of your fly line, that's where throwing in mends can help. If you notice the fly is a lot faster, then you maybe want to throw a downstream mend, okay, and then as it catches up, it'll connect right at the strike zone, and then you can finish out your drift. If you notice that it's slower, the opposite. You throw in an upstream mend, and then you let that fly line catch up. Essentially, you're trying to make sure that the system stays tight through the drift before you make your 2 steps downstream. If you need more depth, maybe you cast a little higher. Rather than 45 degrees, now you're straight across, you cast straight across, and you give yourself an upstream mend, and now you're reconnecting with that taut line a little further down the stream. Swinging is a really great way to cover really good ground, because you're taking a couple of steps downstream and repeating the process every so often, and basically not sweating small stuff every nook and cranny. So swinging for fish has its advantages and disadvantages. Swinging for fish allows you to cover lots of ground very quickly, but it does require the fish to be in kind of that attack mode. You're looking for players, and usually though, by swinging streamers, you're also looking for some pretty aggressive and big fish. Now you're going to catch a lot of browns this way too, especially if they are in the mood. They're not in the egg mood, but they're in the defensive mood, if you would, or if they're in the aggressive mood. So swinging has its advantages there, and this is a great way to fish all season for pretty, again, aggressive fish we call players. So now we're going to take a look at the second way that is, I think, just either the most common or probably the most accessible for most anglers, and that is indicator fishing, bobber fishing, or whatever you want to call it. So when we're looking at indicator fishing, basically I like to have a slightly longer, like 9 to 10 foot rod in a softer rod, and that's a little different than some people like to do the traditional like 9'7" or 9'8" weight. I like to go a 9.5 to 10 foot 6-weight where I fish, and that gives me longer leverage to manipulate my line. Obviously, fishing a floating line on a nice reel. This happens to be a Snowy Spectre. This is the cassette version, and this is a Snowy Davy Wotten, and this is a Spectre floating weight forward line, or you can double taper, it doesn't really matter. Essentially anything you can manipulate and mend on the water, basically to allow you to control your drift a little bit better, is going to be ideal.
When I fish indicators, it's a game of seams, and if I'm fishing an indicator system, I'm essentially going to look to make a drift or a drag-free drift with your indicator that's supporting a fly about 1.5 times the depth you're fishing. It's slightly less modular because of on streams that change depth often, but it's a really good system to fish long distances. So I could fish 40, 50 feet out if I wanted to. Now, say for example, I'm sitting perpendicular to the stream. The stream is going from my left to the right. I make my cast out above the fish, and I notice that I'm getting a lot of drag because my fly line, which is in front of me, is moving way faster, which means the water in front of me that I'm sitting in is faster than the water that I'm fishing. Well, that's an easy fix. You can either make a cast and then upstream mend, meaning that you have to put your fly line above because it's faster, and that gives us more buffer so that by the time it finishes its drift, it is basically catching up to the fly. Or if it's the opposite, if the fly is dragging the fly line, because dragging backwards because the fly line is going slower than the fly, it's the opposite. You just throw a different mend in. You throw an upstream mend, or maybe you make a cast out and then you throw a mend in. It's a really pretty self-explanatory system. You're trying to correct the speed difference in the currents. Now, that being said, try to keep as much of your fly line off the water as possible, but you can't always correct that because sometimes when you're fishing 50 feet out, you need to lay line on the water. That's why in most situations I try to fish as far below the fish as I can, making my casts just to the side of where the fish are, so I'm not drifting anything over top of them directly. Usually a good system, but your strikes are going to be a lot slower than the next system, which is that Euro system. But again, it's a really good entry-level system to fish chunky flies and chunky systems, weighted systems, in especially heavy current. Because you can get some pretty durable indicators that will suspend basically anything.
Indicator fishing has its advantages, and one of the advantages for that is it's really kind of the way people get their feet wet when it comes to fishing for these bigger fish. And additionally, you can use some of the normal tackle and some of the normal flies you have for the regular season, or just regular nymphs and or eggs or patterns, and drift these patterns kind of according to depth. And so it's really advantageous for different depth changes, and also lets you really tailor specifically to different pockets or different fish, or target different fish and different runs that you see fit for the occasion. One disadvantage to this, I think, is that it takes time to dissect the different runs and pockets, but that's okay because it allows you to make calculated and specific casts and drifts through different parts, and allows you to adjust for depth fairly easily. And the third way we're going to look to catch these fish is kind of a modification to the indicator fishing rig, and that's going to be the tightline or Euro nymphing style of fishing, and the different advantages and disadvantages we have with that. Alright, so when tightline or Euro nymphing, it's a similar setup to the indicator. However, there's some pretty interesting changes. So obviously your fly line is going to be modified slightly. Either you're going to be using a braid or a mono core, or a mono rig entirely. The biggest difference is you're looking for longer length in the Euro rod, you're looking for down-locking reel seats, you're looking for a butt, fighting butt, the taper is different, and the fighting of fish is a little bit different too. So let's go take a look at some techniques to help you better catch fish on a tightline or Euro rig.
So what I want to do is I want to talk about the Euro or tightline system here in as simple a term as possible. I'm going to be using this weight forward fly line to simulate our Euroline or our mono rig. And a couple things you have to consider is that you're going to be fishing a lot tighter, 25, 20 feet in. But that's okay because you're fishing really narrow diameter line, and typically too, you're fishing barbless hooks and a lighter rig to help really protect that tippet. So essentially you have weighted tungsten nymphs under some like 4-5x for steelhead. I know it sounds crazy, but you can do it. Especially with a Euro rod like a 4-weight or a 2-weight, for example, you can really protect that tippet. Essentially, I'm making a cast up, say up there, and throughout my drift, I'm trying to keep as tight a contact as possible with those bottom nymphs. And what I'm able to do then is lead the nymphs by about this much. It's only a couple of inches, so say my drift were to be straight out in front of me right now, I'd essentially want to basically lead it by about, I don't know, 2-3 inches. And I have my line in my other hand, and if I need to, I'm trying to keep my shoulders straight and my rod tip same plane as possible. Only let it get, giving a little bit of line with my fingers, or maybe I'm pulling up a little bit with my hand here. If I need to go over a shelf, if I need to go plunge into a pool, I can give it a little bit. I can give it a little bit with my hands, with my right hand, dip down a little bit if I need to, but it allows you to stay in great contact. Essentially, if this little bow I have right there, bow in the line, goes taut, or dips or bounces or goes in any direction, I set the hook. And the cool part is, if there's nothing at the end of it, it was just a little nick on the surface, you can cast back out and then do it again. Cast back out and do it again. Or you can give a little soft check there, and if nothing, you just let the line sink back down and you continue your run. Tight line nymphing is probably the most effective way if you know there are fish there. However, it takes a lot longer to cover water, and you don't get to fish quite as far. So if I'm fishing something and I need to get my line like 30-40 feet out, probably not going to try and Euro nymph it. Ideally, I'd probably throw an indicator on and then do that, or bring 2 rods and effectively fish it that way. However, you get better feel. You usually feel eats better. You see eats better, but there are always positives and negatives when it comes to these different systems.
So, as you can see, it's a very tight, very meticulous way to fish for different fish, whether you see them or don't, in a run. Advantages would be that you can basically fish an entire run at specific depth without having to change your rig. Additionally, it's probably one of the easiest ways to feel, see, and identify a strike, so you miss fewer fish. Apart from that, it actually does mean that you're covering water a lot slower. So that usually doesn't matter when it comes to the waters I fish, because I'm looking for very specific water for holding fish, but for bigger water systems, that might not work for you. You might be better off swinging or indicator fishing if you're from a boat. So just different strokes for different folks. I just thought I'd just present these to you, and at least the ways that I see fit for them to be fished and how to do that. But if you like the video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, check out the other videos in the playlist. Also, if you're interested in some flies that you can use to use these different techniques for these fish, check the links below. I fish super inexpensive flies from my own fly shop, so please give us a check. 12 flies for $9.99 is not bad. So I appreciate you guys. Thank you so much. Please, again, give the video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, check out the other videos in the playlist, and until next time, guys, catch you guys on the flip side. Tight lines, and we're out.